This is Land of Havilah, 1 Chronicles 21. This chapter is very similar to 2 Samuel 24. It's David's census of Israel. Verse 1. Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to take a census of Israel. Comment: the Hebrew word for Satan also means adversary, so it could also be translated an adversary stood up against Israel and moved David to take a census of Israel. So option 1, Satan moved David, and option 2, an adversary moved David. It might have been that an adversarial nation threatened Israel, therefore David wanted to count his army. Anyhow, the census will offend Yahweh because Yahweh taught Israel many times that numbers didn't matter. Yahweh would either turn them over to their enemies or defend them based on whether they were obedient to the law. Leviticus 26. David's census is a result of unbelief. He's thinking numbers will save him. He's not taking Yahweh into account. Coming up, David will instruct his commander of the army, Joab, to start the census. Verse 2. David said to Joab and to the princes of the people, "Go count Israel from Beersheba even to Dan, and bring me word, that I may know how many there are." Joab said, "May Yahweh make his people 100 times as many as they are. But, my lord the king, aren't they all my lord's servants? Why does my lord require this thing? Why will he be a cause of guilt to Israel?" Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab. Therefore Joab departed and went throughout all Israel, then came to Jerusalem. Comment: Joab and his men traveled throughout Israel for 9 months and 20 days, taking the census. 2 Samuel 24:8. In verse 14, Joab returned to Jerusalem. Verse 5. Joab gave up the sum of the census of the people to David. All those of Israel were 1,100,000 men who drew a sword, and in Judah 470,000 men who drew a sword. Comment in verse 5, it was a census of men who drew the sword, meaning a counting of military-aged males fit for war. The total was 1.57 million, which was 1.3 million, as given in 2 Samuel 24. There are many seeming discrepancies along these lines between the Chronicles and the parallel passages of the Samuels and Kings. None of the discrepancies make any theological difference. According to 1 Chronicles 27:24, the census incited Yahweh's wrath. Therefore, quote, the number wasn't put into the Chronicles of King David, end quote. So David was afraid to record it, which introduces another difficulty in knowing what exactly the number was. Speaking of Joab and the number he reported, verse 6, but he didn't count Levi and Benjamin among them, for the king's word was abominable to Joab. Comment: Joab left out Levi and Benjamin because he didn't want the final number to be accurate. He had a strong feeling from the beginning that Yahweh would object, in verse 3. Levi was a good tribe not to count because in the law of Moses, Levi was exempt from military service. Numbers 1:47-54. Yahweh assigned Levi to guard the tabernacle. Numbers 1:51. With regard to the census, verse 7, God was displeased with this thing, therefore he struck Israel. Comment: Yahweh struck Israel, with more information coming. Coming up, David will realize his guilt, and seer is another word for prophet. Verse 8. David said to God, I have sinned greatly in that I have done this thing, but now put away, I beg you, the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. Yahweh spoke to Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and speak to David, saying, Yahweh says, I offer you 3 things. Choose one of them that I may do it to you. So Gad came to David and said to him, Yahweh says, take your choice, either 3 years of famine or 3 months to be consumed before your foes, while the sword of your enemies overtakes you, or else 3 days of the sword of Yahweh, even pestilence in the land, and Yahweh's angel destroying throughout all the borders of Israel. Now therefore consider what answer I shall return to him who sent me. Comment in verse 12, the choices are 3 years of famine, 3 months of consumption by enemies, or 3 days of the sword of Yahweh, which will come in the form of pestilence. Verse 13, David said to Gad, I'm in distress. Let me fall, I pray, into Yahweh's hand, for his mercies are very great. Don't let me fall into man's hand. Comment, David says, let it be famine or pestilence, because those are from Yahweh. Don't let it be war, because that would put me at the mercy of man. I'd rather be at the mercy of Yahweh, quote, for his mercies are very great, end quote. Verse 14, so Yahweh sent a pestilence on Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell. Comment, coming up, the destroying angel is still on the loose and arriving at Jerusalem. Verse 15, God sent an angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. As he was about to destroy, Yahweh saw, and he relented of the disaster, and said to the destroying angel, it is enough. Now withdraw your hand. Yahweh's angel was standing by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Comment, Yahweh's angel ceased his destruction at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Yahweh's angel in this case was a manifestation of Yahweh himself, because 2 Chronicles 3:1 says David was seeing Yahweh. Quote, Yahweh appeared to David on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, end quote. Coming up, David's seeing Yahweh's angel still as we speak. Verse 16, David lifted up his eyes and saw Yahweh's angel standing between earth and the sky, having a drawn sword in his hand stretched out over Jerusalem. Then David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell on their faces. David said to God, Isn't it I who commanded the people to be counted? It is even I who have sinned and done very wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand, O Yahweh my God, be against me and against my father's house, but not against your people, that they should be plagued. Comment, David saw an angel standing between the earth and the sky with his sword drawn and stretched out over Jerusalem. He says, punish me and my father's house, and not all Israel. He's praying for Yahweh's mercy. This foreshadows what Christ the Son did. When Christ saw the plague of sin on the world, his solution was to let the punishment fall on himself. Quote, let your hand, O Yahweh my God, be against me and against my father's house, but not against your people, that they should be plagued. End quote, from verse 17. Coming up, Yahweh will answer David through Gad the prophet. Verse 18. Then Yahweh's angel commanded Gad to tell David that David should go up and raise an altar to Yahweh on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Comment, there's a lot of mystery here, because the threshing floor of Ornan is on Mount Moriah, 2 Chronicles 3:1. This is where Yahweh told Abraham to go and sacrifice Isaac, Genesis 22:2, and where David's son Solomon will build the temple, 2 Chronicles 3:1, and where Jesus did much of his public teaching. Jesus was consumed with zeal for that place, John 2:17. It'll be forever associated with the near sacrifice of Isaac and thousands of animal sacrifices that all foreshadowed the sacrifice of Christ. Verse 19. David went up at the saying of Gad, which he spoke in Yahweh's name. Comment, as we'll find out, David went up to the threshing floor with the intention of purchasing it for the building of an altar. Coming up, Ornan and his sons saw the angel as well. They know something very supernatural is going on. Verse 20. Ornan turned back and saw the angel, and his 4 sons who were with him hid themselves. Now Ornan was threshing wheat. Comment, poor Ornan and his sons were minding their own business, threshing wheat, when Yahweh's angel appeared over them with a sword in his hand. Threshing means to beat or force the grain off the stalks. As we'll find out, they were using oxen for threshing. The oxen were hooked up to a sledge, pulling it over the wheat. After threshing comes gathering up the wheat and disposing of the chaff. Speaking of Christ, who may be the angel of Yahweh in this event, quote, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he'll thoroughly cleanse his threshing floor. He'll gather his wheat into the barn, but the chaff he'll burn up with unquenchable fire. Matthew 3:12. Verse 21. As David came to Ornan, Ornan looked and saw David and went out of the threshing floor and bowed himself to David with his face to the ground. Comment, now Ornan sees the king coming, which is increasing his anxiety. He stepped out of the threshing floor and bowed to the ground. Verse 22. Then David said to Ornan, give me the place of this threshing floor, that I may build an altar to Yahweh on it. You shall sell it to me for the full price, that the plague may be stopped from afflicting the people. Ornan said to David, take it for yourself, and let my lord the king do that which is good in his eyes. Behold, I give the oxen for the burnt offerings, and the threshing instruments for wood, and the wheat for the meal offering. I give it all." King David said to Ornan, "No, but I will most certainly buy it for the full price, for I'll not take that which is yours for Yahweh, nor offer a burnt offering that costs me nothing." So David gave to Ornan 600 shekels of gold by weight for the place. Comment: that was rife with foreshadowing as well. Ornan said, "Allow me to give it all as a donation, the threshing floor for the altar, the oxen for the sacrifices, the wood for the sacrifice. I'll absorb all the cost." David said, "No, the cost will be on me. I'll take what you're offering, but I'll pay full price." So it is between us and Christ. You and I were scared out of our minds because Yahweh was standing over us with a sword to destroy us. We said, "Let's sacrifice at our own expense." But Christ said, "No, I'll use what you have, but the cost will be completely on me to hold back Yahweh's sword from you." As it says in verse 22, quote, "that the plague may be stopped from afflicting the people," end quote. Christ didn't want to exact the cost from us, but from himself. Verse 26, David built an altar to Yahweh there and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and called on Yahweh, and he answered him from the sky by fire on the altar of burnt offering. Comment: when Yahweh sends fire to an altar, it's a sign of his favor, Leviticus 9:24 and Judges 6:21. Yahweh's accepting the sacrifice with an exclamation point of fire. Verse 27, Then Yahweh commanded the angel, and he put his sword back into its sheath. At that time, when David saw that Yahweh had answered him in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he sacrificed there. Comment: David made more sacrifices after the first ones. He's thankful Yahweh accepted the first ones. Coming up, the reason David didn't go to the tabernacle to sacrifice. Verse 29, For Yahweh's tabernacle, which Moses made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offering were at that time in the high place at Gibeon, but David couldn't go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid because of the sword of Yahweh's angel. Comment: the tabernacle's been Ichabod ever since Yahweh removed the ark from it, 1 Samuel 4:21. In verse 30, David didn't know how Yahweh would respond to sacrifices at the tabernacle and didn't want to take any chances there. The big takeaway from this chapter is that Satan incited us to sin. God was ready to use his sword against us, but Jesus paid the price to hold him back. He won't allow us to make that sacrifice ourselves. No one's sacrifice but the king's will do. This is one of many events in the Old Testament that foreshadowed the atoning work of Christ. 1 Chronicles 22 is next.